homeless at 45. Then Grace knocked on my door. My name is Angela. I'm 45 years old, and I used to believe that life had a limit, that once you crossed a certain line of failure, there was no coming back. I believed that line was homelessness, and I had crossed it. It was a Tuesday morning, cold and gray, and I was sitting on a splintered bench outside a closed-down gas station in downtown Atlanta. My coat was thin, my socks were damp, and my stomach hadn't known a proper meal in days. I clutched a crumpled paper cup with a few coins inside, not enough for coffee, not enough for hope. I remember watching people rush past me, eyes forward, pretending I wasn't there. I didn't blame them. I wouldn't have looked at me either. That morning, something inside me cracked. I wasn't just tired, I was done. Done pretending I was strong, done believing I could fix it. I whispered into the wind, "God, if you're real, I need you, because I don't want to wake up tomorrow." I didn't grow up like this. I was raised in a small town in Georgia, the daughter of a school teacher and a mechanic. We didn't have much, but we had faith. I sang in the choir, memorized verses, and believed in miracles. But somewhere along the way, life got louder than God. I chased success, married young, divorced younger, and spent years trying to prove I was enough. I climbed corporate ladders, wore designer heels, and smiled through the emptiness. Then came the layoffs, the debt, the eviction, the shame. I burned bridges with family, lost touch with friends, and ended up sleeping in shelters, then on sidewalks. I told myself I was surviving, but the truth, I was fatting. That bench became my altar. Not because it was holy, but because it was the place I finally surrendered. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if anyone, even God, was listening. But I spoke anyway. I cried. I confessed. I begged. I used to think rock bottom was a single moment, a crash, a bang, a final fall. But mine was a slow slide. It started with a layoff, one email, one meeting, one handshake. "We appreciate your service, Angela." That's what they said. I walked out with a box of desk trinkets and a severance check that barely lasted 3 months. I told myself I'd bounce back. I had experience, connections, drive, but the job market didn't care. Rejection after rejection chipped away at my confidence. I started drinking again, just a glass at night, then 2, then bottles. My kids stopped calling. My ex-husband stopped answering. I stopped trying. The bills piled up. I sold my furniture, then my car. I moved into a friend's basement, then a motel, then nowhere. I remember the day I handed over my apartment keys. I stood in the empty living room, staring at the stain on the carpet, and whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't know who I was apologizing to, maybe God, maybe myself. I didn't plan to be homeless. No one does. But when shame becomes your shadow, you stop asking for help. You start believing you deserve the silence. The first night on the street was the hardest. I curled up behind a dumpster, clutching my duffel bag like a lifeline. Every sound felt like a threat. I didn't sleep, I just waited for morning. Days blurred together. I learned which churches gave out sandwiches, which shelters had space, which alleys were safest. I became invisible. People passed me like I was scenery. I stopped looking in mirrors. I didn't want to see what I'd become. I got sick. A cough that wouldn't quit. My legs ached. My skin cracked. I tried to get help, but clinics asked for ID, insurance, appointments. I had none. I started talking to myself, not out of madness, but loneliness. I missed hearing my own name. I missed being seen. I missed mattering. One night, I found a Bible in a donation box. I stared at it for hours. I hadn't opened one in years. I remembered verses from childhood. "The Lord is my shepherd," but they felt distant, like echoes from a life I no longer lived. I asked God to show up. I didn't expect him to, but I asked anyway. Days passed. The cold got worse. My cough turned into something deeper, something that rattled my chest. I hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. My body was giving up, and I knew it. I sat on that bench outside the gas station, feeling the weight of every choice I'd ever made. The rain started again, soaking through my thin coat. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and thought, this is it. I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of dying forgotten, of becoming just another statistic, another nameless person who slipped through the cracks. I whispered, God, if you're real, please, I can't do this anymore. My voice cracked. My heart felt hollow. I didn't want a miracle, I just wanted mercy. I cried, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that slipped down my cheeks and mixed with the rain. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I just knew I couldn't go on like this. And then she came. I didn't hear her footsteps. I just saw a pair of yellow rain boots stop in front of me. I looked up, and there she was, a woman in a bright coat holding a cup of coffee. You look like you could use grace, she said. I blinked. What? She smiled. My name's Grace. I laughed, a broken, raspy laugh. Of course it is. She handed me the coffee. It was warm, real. I held it like it was sacred. Grace sat beside me. She didn't ask for my story. She didn't flinch at my smell. She just talked about the weather, her church, her dog named Moses. She made me feel human. Before she left, she said, I'll be back tomorrow, same time. I didn't believe her. People didn't come back, but she did. The next day, I woke up on that bench expecting nothing. But at exactly the same time, those yellow boots appeared again. Grace brought coffee and a muffin this time. She sat down like we were old friends. She asked about my name, my story, but gently, never pressing. I told her bits and pieces. She listened like every word mattered. Over the next few weeks, she kept showing up, rain or shine. She brought food, socks, sometimes just conversation. She never pitied me. She saw me. And that did something to my soul. One day, she handed me a small card. It had the name of a church and a handwritten note. You are not forgotten. Come if you're ready. I stared at it for hours. I wasn't sure I believed in church anymore, but I believed in grace. The first time I walked into that church, I felt like an intruder. My clothes were worn, my hair unwashed, my heart guarded. But no one stared. No one whispered. A greeter smiled and handed me a bulletin like I belonged there. I sat in the back row, near the exit, just in case. The worship music started, and something inside me stirred. I hadn't heard songs like that in years, not since I was a teenager, singing in the youth choir. Then the pastor spoke, not about rules or religion, but about restoration. He said, God doesn't wait for you to clean up before he calls you home. I felt like he was talking directly to me. I cried through the whole service, not because I was sad, but because I felt safe. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a mistake. That night, Grace gave me a Bible. Start with John, she said. It's where I started when I was lost. I took it back to my spot behind the old bookstore. I sat under the flickering street lamp and opened to the first page of John. In the beginning was the Word. I read slowly, letting the words sink in. I didn't understand everything, but I felt something like light breaking through fog. I kept reading. I underlined verses. I whispered prayers I hadn't said in decades. That Bible became my anchor. I carried it everywhere. When the nights were cold, I held it to my chest. When the days were long, I read it like a lifeline. Little by little, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, God hadn't given up on me. The church helped me get into a shelter. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm. I had a bed, a shower, and 3 meals a day. I felt human again. I started seeing a doctor. The cough was bronchitis, treatable. I got antibiotics, vitamins, even a checkup. I hadn't seen a doctor in years. I cried when the nurse called me Miss Angela. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be addressed with dignity. I began attending Bible study. I was quiet at first, just listening. But one day I shared my story. The room went silent. Then someone said, "Thank you for being brave." I didn't feel brave. I felt broken. But maybe brokenness was the beginning of healing. I started volunteering at the church pantry, just stacking cans, sweeping floors, but it mattered. I mattered. One afternoon, I sat in the church office with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. Grace had encouraged me to write to my children. I hadn't spoken to them in years. I didn't know if they'd respond, but I had to try. I wrote to my daughter first. I told her I was sorry for missing birthdays, for disappearing, for the pain I caused. I told her I was getting help, that I'd found Jesus again, that I loved her. Then I wrote to my son. I told him I remembered the way he used to laugh when I tickled his feet. I told him I still carried his kindergarten photo in my wallet. I mailed the letters with trembling hands. I didn't expect a reply, but I needed them to know I was still here, still trying, still their mother. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hope blossoming inside my chest. 2 weeks after mailing the letters, I got a call. I was sweeping the church pantry when my name echoed through the hallway. "Angela, phone for you." My heart stopped. No one called me. I picked up the receiver with trembling hands. "Hello." "Mom." It was my daughter. Her voice was older, steadier, but still hers. I couldn't speak. I just cried. She said she got my letter. She'd read it 3 times. She didn't know what to say, but she wanted me to know she hadn't stopped loving me. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was trying. We talked for 20 minutes. She told me about college, her part-time job, her little brother. I listened like a sponge soaking up sunlight. Before she hung up, she said, "I'm proud of you for getting help." I held that sentence like a trophy. It was the first time in years I felt like a mother again. One morning, I stood in front of the shelter's bathroom mirror. I barely recognized myself, thinner, older, worn, but there was something new in my eyes. Peace. I touched my face and whispered, "You're still here." I thought about all the times I'd wanted to disappear, all the nights I'd begged God to take me. And yet, here I was, alive, healing, hopeful. I didn't hate myself anymore. I didn't carry shame like a second skin. I was learning to forgive, not just others, but me. I started journaling every day. I wrote prayers, memories, dreams. I wrote about grace, about the church, about Jesus. I wrote about the bench where I broke and the Bible that rebuilt me. And slowly, I began to see myself not as a failure, but as a testimony. My story had meaning. My pain had purpose. Pastor James asked me to share my story at the women's recovery group. I said no at first. I wasn't ready, but Grace nudged me gently. "Your story isn't just yours," she said. "It's someone else's lifeline." So I stood in front of 12 women, all survivors, all fighters, and told them about the bench, the rain, the whisper to God. I told them about grace, about the Bible under the street lamp, about the letters to my children. I cried, they cried. One woman hugged me afterward and said, "I thought I was alone." That night, I realized my pain had purpose. My scars were sacred. My story wasn't just survival, it was resurrection. The women in that group became my sisters. We prayed together, laughed together, held each other up when the weight got too heavy. We were all broken pieces learning to be whole again. The church helped me apply for a job at a local cleaning service. I got it. Minimum wage, early mornings, hard work, but it was mine. I showed up every day on time with gratitude. I cleaned offices, scrubbed floors, emptied trash bins. I prayed over every space I entered. I whispered blessings over desks and doorways. After 3 months, I saved enough for a deposit on a small apartment. Grace drove me to sign the lease. When the landlord handed me the key, I held it like a crown. I walked into that empty space and dropped to my knees. "Thank you, Jesus," I whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I decorated my apartment with thrift store finds and scriptures taped to the walls. I bought a second-hand couch, a lamp, a coffee maker, small things that made it home. I hosted Bible study in my living room. Just me, Grace, and 2 women from the shelter. We read, we prayed, we laughed. We shared stories of brokenness and healing. We sang worship songs off-key and off-script. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was building a sanctuary. One night, I looked around the room and saw joy. Real joy. Not the kind you fake for photos, the kind that blooms from ashes. And I knew this was grace, not just the woman in the yellow coat, but the divine kind. The kind that knocks when you're at your lowest and says, "I'm here." Grace became more than my friend. She became my sister. We planted a small garden behind my apartment. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, nothing fancy, just life growing from soil. We watered it together, laughed at our mistakes, celebrated every sprout. It became our ritual. Our reminder that broken things can grow again. One Sunday after service, Pastor James approached me with a gentle smile. "Angela," he said, "would you consider sharing your testimony at next month's community night?" I froze, speaking in front of strangers, telling them I'd lived behind dumpsters and begged for food. But then I remembered the women in the recovery group, how my story had touched them, how God had used my brokenness to bring healing. I nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll do it." That night, I prayed harder than I ever had, not for eloquence, but for courage. I didn't want to impress anyone. I just wanted to be honest. The sanctuary was full. Families, students, elders, all gathered for community night. I stood behind the podium, heart pounding, hands trembling. I took a deep breath and began. I was homeless at 45. I thought my life was over. I thought God had forgotten me. But then grace knocked on my door, literally. I told them everything. The bench, the rain, the Bible under the street lamp, the letters to my children, the healing, the hope. People cried, some nodded, others closed their eyes and whispered prayers. When I finished, the room erupted in applause, but I didn't feel proud. I felt free. That night, I wasn't just Angela the survivor. I was Angela the redeemed. 2 weeks later, I got another call. This time, it was my son. "Mom," he said, "I saw your testimony online. Someone shared it." I held my breath. "I want to see you." We met at a diner near the church. He was taller than I remembered, quieter. But when he hugged me, I felt years melt away. We talked for hours. He asked questions. I answered with honesty. He told me he'd been angry, confused, hurt. I told him I understood. Before he left, he said, "I'm glad you didn't give up." Neither did he. One afternoon, Grace and I sat in my garden watching the tomatoes ripen. I asked her why she kept coming back to that bench. She smiled. "Because God told me someone was waiting. I didn't know it was you, but he did." I hugged her tight. "You were my miracle." She shook her head. "No, Angela, Jesus was. I was just the delivery girl." I started mentoring women at the shelter. Every Thursday, I'd go back to where I'd once slept and share my story. I'd bring food, Bibles, hope. I'd sit with them on their benches and remind them they weren't forgotten. One woman told me, "You make me believe I can survive this." I took her hand and said, "You won't just survive, you'll flourish." Because that's what grace does. It doesn't just rescue, it restores. Today, I'm 48. I have a job, a home, a church family. I speak at shelters, mentor women, and host Bible study every Thursday. But more than that, I have peace. I still walk past that old bench sometimes. I sit there and pray for whoever might be next, because I know what it feels like to be forgotten, and I know what it feels like to be found. Jesus didn't just rescue me, he restored me. He reminded me that grace isn't earned, it's received. My children visit now. We're building something new, not perfect, but real. My daughter calls every Sunday. My son texts me verses he's learning. We're healing together. So if you're reading this, and you feel like you've lost everything, listen closely. Grace might be knocking. Open the door. Because on the other side of your darkest moment, there's a woman in yellow boots. There's a Bible under a street lamp. There's a cup of warm coffee and a reminder that you matter. You're not forgotten. You're not finished. Your story isn't over. It's just beginning.